The two forms had lived separate lifestyles for as long as they could remember. The clonal anemones growing amidst the pounding waves and floods / dry streaks of the high intertidal, the solitary anemones thriving among the often submerged, biodiverse regions of the middle and lower intertidal. Caroline, the clonal A. elegantissima anemone, phylum Cnidaria, class Anthozoa, lived alongside her brother Claudius in a colony of fellow A. elegantissima.
She was small, about 3 centimeters in diameter, but what these clonal anemones lacked in size, they made up for it in numbers. The anemones relied on each other for support and protection, and because of this, their resistance to physical stress made them a better competitor in the exposed environments of the higher intertidal. So the clonal form anemones grew in the higher areas of the intertidal, never coming into much contact with their solitary counterparts. Because they lived so high in the intertidal, predators rarely ventured from the ocean to find them, but they were still subject to slight predation by various organisms.
Meanwhile, Sal, the solitary A. sola anemone, phylum Cnidaria, class Anthozoa, lived in the sands of the lower, more protected microhabitats of the intertidal.
Averaging approximately 12 centimeters across his oral disc, he had beef with the plethora of other organisms within this region. Like other solitary anemones, with their larger size, Sal was more resistant to predation, but he lacked the strength in numbers that his cloner counterparts possessed. So Sal could withstand less physical stress, and in general, less interspecific competition. He lived under ledges in the more sheltered areas he could find underwater, even hiding up to 3/4 of his body under the sand.
Unbeknownst to these individuals, their dietary habits and feeding mechanisms were identical. Anemones waited for fish, urchins, crabs, and other small invertebrates to come by for dinner. Anchoring themselves with their basal disc, they hide from their predators, namely sea slugs, echinoderms, and flounders. When potential prey ventured near the polyps, they would use specialized tentacles called acrohagi. These tentacles contain nematocytes, or stinging cells, that are used to immobilize and paralyze their prey. They then use the tentacles to drag the prey into their mouths.
This video shows an anemone eating a slug. Sal, Caroline, and Claudius were also genetically coded to use their nematocytes as weapons against other anemones greatly genetically different from themselves, something to keep in mind as this great epic begins. Let's set the scene. The greatest storm in all of history. Boats upended, lighthouses destroyed, homes laid waste. And in the midst of all this chaos, a single solitary anemone named Sal clung desperately to life, attempting to remain rooted to his spot in the intertidal.
Sal was tossed around by the gale, floating from spot to spot, until he finally came to a complete standstill. He looked around and found himself on the upper intertidal next to a group of creatures that kinda looked like him. Intrigued, he began to approach them. Unbeknownst to him, however, they were not solitary anemones. They were colonial. He should have known this from the fact that they were smaller than him, and they were all in a group.
Suddenly he looked to his left. His tentacles flexed. His eyes, if he had them, would have popped right out of their eye sockets. She was the most beautiful Nedaria he had ever seen.
Suddenly, one of the anemones, Claudius, began to approach him, Acror Haggai flapping wildly. Something was about to go down. One of Claudius's Acror Haggai made contact with Sal's skin. Immediately, Claudius recognized that Sal's DNA was not the same as his own colony. Sal was an outsider, plus he was sitting on his sister, which was totally unacceptable. Claudius wildly swung his tentacles around. They smacked into the collar of Sal, snapping him back. Incensed, Sal fought back, and the anemones stung each other over and over and over again. The Acror Haggai of the anemones pierced each other, shooting immobilizing nematocysts into each other with reckless abandon. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, Claudius was paralyzed. The larger Sal had completely robbed him of his movement. Sal sauntered over to Caroline and said to her,
"Hey, baby girl, want to reproduce?"
Caroline smacked him across the face with her tentacle and replied,
"Never in a million years. I reproduce sexually only with members of my own colony, and even if my whole colony were dead, I would just reproduce asexually."
Ow.
With that, the whole colony began attacking Sal, stinging him again and again, paralyzing him beyond belief. Pretty soon, Sal could no longer move, and the colony stared on in contempt.
You see, Sal didn't know one important rule of anemone reproduction. While solitary anemones only reproduce sexually, clonal anemones reproduce asexually, or sometimes sexually, but only within their own colony. This reproductive barrier, in fact, has led to their classification as different species. The solitary anemone became known as A. sola, while the clonal anemone retained its name as A. elegantissima. And thus, the first chapter of Anemone Wars comes to an end, with Sal dying a painful death due to starvation as a sad, lonely boy, unable to move.